The weight of the day settled on me like a heavy cloak as I trudged up the stairs to our small, cozy apartment. I'd spent hours in a stuffy conference room with a client who couldn't decide if their brand should look bold and modern or classic and understated. My mind buzzed with half-finished concepts, and all I wanted was to sink into my favorite corner of the couch with a blanket and a glass of wine. Daniel, my boyfriend of 3 years, wouldn't be home for hours. Being a lawyer meant late nights and endless case prep, especially with a trial looming. He always said he hated leaving me alone, but I had grown used to it. Besides, his younger brother Alex, who had been staying with us for the past few months, would probably be around. Not that his presence added much noise or company. Alex was a mystery wrapped in sarcasm and shrugged indifference. As I stepped into the apartment, I paused. Something felt off. The usual hum of the TV or the faint sound of Alex's music was missing. The air was still almost too quiet. "Alex," I called out, setting my bag down by the door. No response. His motorcycle was parked outside, so I knew he hadn't gone out. After grabbing a glass of water, I wandered through the living room, glancing toward the stairs. The faintest sound reached me, muffled and rhythmic, coming from upstairs. Curiosity tugged at me as I made my way up. The hallway was dim, the overhead light flickering faintly as I passed. Steam billowed softly from the bathroom door, left slightly ajar, curling lazily into the cooler air of the hallway. I paused outside the door, debating whether to knock or retreat, but the rhythmic scrubbing sound continued, punctuated by a low sigh, frustration maybe. I leaned forward, peeking through the crack of the door. My breath caught. Alex stood at the sink, his back partially turned toward me. He was in a black tank top that clung to his frame, his broad shoulders tense as he scrubbed furiously at his arm with a damp washcloth. The tattoo on his forearm was still fresh, the ink dark and stark against his skin, surrounded by faint redness. I couldn't help but notice the way his jaw was set, tight with frustration, his lips pressed into a thin line as he worked at the mark on his skin. He looked so much younger in that moment, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. As if sensing my presence, Alex turned abruptly, his dark eyes locked onto mine, wide with surprise and a flicker of panic. His hand shot out, covering the tattoo instinctively. "Sophia," he said, his voice a mix of sharpness and embarrassment. "What are you doing?" I stumbled back a step, mortified at having been caught. "I'm sorry," I stammered, holding up my hands. "I didn't mean to. I heard something, and the door was open." "Don't tell Daniel," he cut in, his voice rising slightly before trailing off. His shoulders slumped as he exhaled heavily. "Please, just don't." There was something raw in his tone that made me pause. His usual cocky, dismissive demeanor was gone, replaced by genuine fear, or maybe shame. I crossed my arms, hesitating before speaking. "I won't tell him," I said gently.
"But..."
"Alex, are you okay?" He stared at me for a long moment, the tension in his posture easing slightly. "It's nothing," he muttered, glancing down at the tattoo again. "Just a ST*PID mistake." I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. The room was warm and humid, the mirror fogged over, droplets of water sliding lazily down its surface. "Want to talk about it?" Alex hesitated, his lips parting as if to speak before he closed them again. Finally, he let out a defeated sigh. "I was out with some friends. One thing led to another, and I got this." He gestured vaguely at the ink. "I didn't even think about it. Now Daniel's going to kill me." I raised an eyebrow. "It's just a tattoo, Alex. I don't think he'll murder you over it." "You don't know him like I do," he muttered, running a hand through his damp hair. "He's always on my case about making better choices. This is just going to prove him right." His words struck a chord with me, reminding me of my own younger self. I leaned against the counter, giving him a small smile. "I get it. My parents flipped out when I got my first tattoo. They acted like I joined a biker gang or something." That earned a faint chuckle from Alex, and I pressed on. "Everyone makes impulsive decisions, Alex. It's part of being human. The important thing is owning it." He looked at me then, his expression softening. "Thanks," he said quietly, "for not telling him. And for, not freaking out." I smiled. "Anytime." Before I could step away, Alex hesitated, then leaned in quickly and pressed a light kiss to my cheek. His lips were warm against my skin, the gesture surprisingly sweet. "You're the best," he said softly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected affection. But as I looked at him, I saw gratitude in his eyes, a flicker of the boy he must have been before life had weighed him down. "Don't mention it," I said, my voice a little quieter than before. After that strange and unexpected moment in the bathroom, I couldn't quite shake the weight of Alex's vulnerability. The way he looked at me, caught between guilt and relief, lingered in my mind long after I left him there. I had promised not to tell Daniel, and though I wasn't entirely sure keeping secrets between the brothers was the right thing to do, I knew Alex needed someone to trust. As I changed into something more comfortable, I replayed the scene over and over. There had been a rawness in Alex that I rarely saw. He always carried himself with an air of indifference, a shield of sarcasm, and with that he used to keep people at a distance. But tonight, that shield had cracked. It made me wonder how much of his aloofness was just a mask to hide the fear of judgment, the fear of letting anyone down, especially Daniel. Alex's kiss on my cheek had startled me. It wasn't romantic, not in the way an outsider might assume, but it was deeply personal. A gesture of gratitude, of recognition. He wasn't the type to express his emotions openly, and for him to offer even that small moment of closeness spoke volumes. It made me realize how isolated he must feel, living in the shadow of his older brother, who seemed to excel at everything. I busied myself around the apartment, tidying up to distract my thoughts, but the quiet only amplified them. The weight of Alex's trust settled heavily on me. It wasn't the tattoo itself that bothered him, that much was clear. It was what it represented, a moment of impulsiveness, yes, but also a moment of rebellion, of independence. And yet he feared it would be seen as a failure, another strike against him in Daniel's eyes. Daniel and Alex's relationship had always intrigued me. Daniel had taken on a paternal role after their parents passed away, but he was more protector than nurturer. He pushed Alex hard, often too hard, without always recognizing how much pressure he was putting on him. I admired Daniel's dedication to his brother, but I sometimes wished he could see Alex as more than a project to manage or a younger version of himself to mold. The house was still warm from the steam that had lingered upstairs, and I opened a window in the kitchen, letting the crisp night air cool the space. As I stood there, looking out at the darkened street below, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility. Alex needed someone who didn't see him as a screw-up or a kid with too much to prove. He needed someone who could meet him where he was without judgment. That night, I lay in bed long after I turned off the lights, staring at the ceiling. My mind was a tangle of thoughts, about Alex, about Daniel, about the delicate balance of our little household. I wanted to believe I was doing the right thing by keeping Alex a secret, but a part of me wondered if I was simply delaying an inevitable confrontation. Still, I couldn't bring myself to betray the trust he had placed in me. It wasn't just the promise I had made. It was the look in his eyes, the quiet plea that had spoken louder than words. Alex wasn't just Daniel's younger brother anymore. He had become someone I cared about deeply in his own right. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I resolved to help him find his footing. Not by solving his problems for him, but by showing him that he didn't have to face them alone. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting soft, golden stripes across the walls of my room. Despite the warmth of the sun, I felt chilled, the memory of last night wrapping around me like an invisible fog. Alex's voice, his plea to keep his secret, and the unexpected tenderness of his kiss on my cheek had replayed in my mind long after I'd gone to bed. I moved through the morning like I was on autopilot, brushing my teeth, pulling on a loose sweater, tying my hair into a low bun. Each motion felt mechanical, as if distancing myself from my thoughts would somehow quiet them. But the truth was impossible to ignore. Things had shifted between Alex and me, though I wasn't entirely sure how or why. When I finally emerged from my room and headed to the kitchen, I wasn't surprised to find Alex there. He was always an early riser, though he rarely made a sound, quietly brewing coffee, scrolling through his phone, or tinkering with some project. Today, he stood at the counter with his back to me, cradling a mug in both hands. I paused in the doorway, watching him for a moment. His posture was different, less confident, more introspective. Even from behind, I could sense the tension in his shoulders, the way his head tilted slightly downward as though weighed down by unseen burdens. Clearing my throat softly, I stepped into the room. Alex glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable as his eyes met mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, the air between us charged with an unspoken awareness. I moved to the coffee maker, the clink of the pot against the counter sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. As I poured myself a cup, I couldn't help but feel his gaze lingering on me. It wasn't invasive or uncomfortable. It was searching, almost hesitant, as though he were trying to gauge my mood or read my thoughts. The tension simmered, unspoken but palpable, as I turned to lean against the counter opposite him. I focused on my coffee, staring into the swirling liquid as if it might hold some answer to the mess of emotions I couldn't quite name. When I finally looked up, Alex had set his mug down. His fingers rested on the edge of the counter, gripping it lightly as if grounding himself. There was a softness in his expression, a vulnerability that I rarely saw. He stepped toward me, slow and deliberate, his movements careful as though he were testing invisible boundaries. My pulse quickened with every inch he closed between us, the room seeming to shrink around us. I couldn't move, not away, not forward. I was rooted in place, caught between curiosity and apprehension. Alex stopped just a foot away, close enough that I could feel the faint warmth radiating from him. His dark eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, the world outside the two of us faded into nothingness. And then, without a word, he leaned in. The kiss was soft at first, a brush of his lips against mine so tentative it was almost hesitant. My breath hitched, the sensation sending a shiver through me. Time seemed to slow, the moment stretching into something endless and fragile. But then it deepened. His hand hovered near my waist, as though asking permission, and his lips pressed more firmly against mine. It wasn't rushed or frantic. It was deliberate, filled with a quiet intensity that took my breath away. I stood frozen, my thoughts racing too fast to grasp. The logical part of me screamed that this was wrong, that we were crossing a line we couldn't uncross. But another part, a deeper, quieter part, responded to the warmth, the softness, the way he seemed to pour unspoken emotion into that kiss. And just as quickly as it began, it ended. Alex pulled back, his breath uneven, his gaze searching mine for a reaction. His face was a mixture of longing and regret, as though he knew he'd overstepped but couldn't bring himself to fully regret it. I felt my cheeks flush, the ghost of his lips still lingering on mine. The silence between us was deafening, filled with all the words we weren't saying. Finally, I stepped back, breaking the spell that had held us. My heart raced as I turned and left the kitchen, retreating to the sanctuary of my room. Behind the closed door, I pressed my fingers to my lips, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It felt surreal, like a dream I wasn't sure I'd fully woken from. But the sensation of his kiss was undeniable, and with it came a flood of emotions I couldn't untangle. Confusion, guilt, and something deeper, something more dangerous. I leaned against the door, closing my eyes and taking slow, measured breaths. My mind replayed the moment over and over, each detail seared into my memory. The warmth of his lips, the way he had looked at me afterward, the faint tremble in his hands as he'd stepped back. What had we done? What had I done? The thought of Daniel, kind, loyal, oblivious Daniel, sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over me. This was his brother, his family. I had crossed a line I never should have even approached. And yet, I couldn't deny that some part of me hadn't wanted to pull away. I stayed in my room for the rest of the morning, unable to face Alex again. But no matter how hard I tried to push it aside, the memory of his kiss lingered, refusing to be ignored. The kiss from the kitchen lingered on my lips like a whispered secret, impossible to ignore. The weight of it hung in the air as Alex and I walked side by side toward the park, our silence a charged thread connecting us. Each step felt deliberate, every motion heavy with unspoken words. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the streets. Shadows stretched long and soft across the pavement, and the crisp evening air carried the faint scent of autumn leaves. Alex's hands were shoved into his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched as though he were trying to shield himself from the vulnerability of the moment. I followed him without question, my thoughts a tangled mess of conflicting emotions. Every rational part of me screamed that this shouldn't be happening, but there was another part, a quieter, insistent voice, that told me it already had. When we reached the park, it was nearly empty, the quiet stillness amplifying the tension between us. The soft rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird were the only sounds breaking the silence. Alex led me down a narrow gravel path that wound through the trees, the canopy overhead filtering the fading sunlight into golden beams. Finally, we came to a small clearing where a bench overlooked a pond. The water was still, its glassy surface reflecting the oranges and pinks of the setting sun. Alex gestured for me to sit, and I sank onto the bench, folding my hands in my lap as he settled beside me. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, laden with everything we weren't saying. I stared at the pond, watching the ripples spread as a lone duck glided across the surface, but my thoughts were entirely elsewhere. Alex shifted beside me, and I felt his eyes on me before I turned to look at him. His gaze was intense, dark and searching, as though he were trying to read something in my expression that I wasn't ready to reveal. The air between us seemed to thrum with electricity, the tension crackling and alive. My breath caught as he leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped loosely together. He looked as though he were about to speak, but instead, he turned his gaze back to the pond, his jaw tightening. I wanted to say something, to break the silence, to shatter the fragile moment hanging between us, but I couldn't find the words. The truth was I didn't trust myself to speak. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Alex turned back to me. His eyes locked onto mine, and the world seemed to fall away. The faint rustle of leaves, the distant hum of traffic, even the cool breeze brushing against my skin. All of it faded until there was only him. He reached out slowly, his hand brushing a strand of hair from my face. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a shiver down my spine. My heart pounded in my chest, the rhythm erratic and insistent, as though urging me forward. Without thinking, I leaned into his touch, my eyes fluttering shut as his fingers lingered against my cheek. When I opened them again, he was closer, his face just inches from mine. The moment stretched on, suspended in time, and then his lips were on mine. This kiss was different from the one in the kitchen. It was slower, more deliberate, as though he were savoring every second. His hand cupped my face, his thumb brushing lightly against my cheekbone, while his other hand rested on the bench between us, grounding us in this stolen moment. I didn't hesitate this time. My hands found their way to his chest, the fabric of his shirt warm beneath my fingers. I could feel the steady thrum of his heartbeat, mirroring my own, as I leaned into him, deepening the kiss. The world around us seemed to blur, the edges fading until there was nothing but him. The softness of his lips, the heat of his touch, the quiet intensity of the moment. It consumed me entirely, leaving no room for doubt or hesitation. When we finally pulled back, it wasn't abrupt or jarring. We lingered, our foreheads nearly touching as we caught our breath. His hand still rested against my cheek, his thumb tracing small, absent-minded circles that sent shivers through me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, not with discomfort but with the weight of what we had just done. Alex's gaze softened, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. He looked at me as though I were something fragile, something precious, and the intensity of it made my chest tighten. The boundaries we'd carefully maintained were gone, erased by a kiss that felt both inevitable and impossible. I knew there was no going back, no pretending that this hadn't happened. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park into shadow, Alex shifted closer, his hand slipping from my face to take my hand. His fingers intertwined with mine, and we sat there in silence, watching the last traces of daylight fade into the dark. I didn't know what would happen next. The weight of the choices we'd made, the consequences waiting just out of reach, loomed large in my mind. But for now, I pushed them aside, allowing myself to exist in this moment, a fragile, fleeting pocket of time where nothing else mattered but him. And for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. The apartment was shrouded in a stillness that felt both comforting and oppressive. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a passing car, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, all seemed to echo in the charged silence between us. Alex stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, his hands gripping the edge as though it were the only thing keeping him steady. His head was bowed slightly, his dark hair falling into his eyes. But I could see the tension in his posture, the unspoken words weighing heavily on him. I hesitated in the doorway, my arms crossed tightly over my chest as though to shield myself from the enormity of what we were about to confront. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one louder and more chaotic than the last, but at the center of it all was him, Alex, and the undeniable truth of what had just happened. "Say something," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine, and the raw vulnerability in his gaze nearly undid me. He didn't move right away, as though he were searching for the right words, but when he spoke, his voice was steady and low. "I don't know how we got here," he said, his words carrying the weight of his emotions. "But I don't regret it." I felt my breath catch, my chest tightening as his confession settled over me. The honesty in his voice, the way he looked at me as though I were the only thing that mattered, it was almost too much to bear. I stepped further into the room, my movements slow and deliberate, until I was standing just a few feet away from him. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder of the line we'd crossed, the bond we'd forged, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. "We shouldn't have let it happen," I said softly, though the words felt hollow even as they left my lips. "But it did?" He nodded, his gaze unwavering as he straightened, taking a small step toward me. The space between us felt impossibly small, the air thick with tension and something I couldn't quite name. "I think we both know this wasn't some accident," he said, his voice low and rough. "We've been heading here for a while." I opened my mouth to protest, to deny the truth of his words, but the memories flashed through my mind. The shared glances, the fleeting touches, the moments that lingered just a little too long. He was right. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until I couldn't stand it anymore. I closed the distance between us, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch his arm. "We've made a mess of things," I said, my voice shaking. "But I can't bring myself to regret it either." His eyes softened then, the tension in his posture easing as he reached up to cup my face in his hands. His touch was gentle, his fingers brushing against my skin in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady and certain. "Whatever this is, whatever it means, we'll figure it out together." And then, before I could say anything else, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft and searching, as though he were asking a question he didn't yet have the answer to. I kissed him back, my hand sliding up to rest on his chest as I let myself fall into the moment. The warmth of his touch, the steady beat of his heart beneath my palms, the way his lips moved against mine, it was all-consuming, a quiet declaration of everything we couldn't yet say. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads rested against each other, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. "This doesn't change how complicated things are," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I know," he replied, his tone soft but resolute. "But it doesn't make it any less real." We stayed like that for a long time, neither of us moving, the weight of our choices hanging heavy in the air. The future felt uncertain, the path ahead unclear, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever happened next, we would face it together,